Hi guys, it's Brooke here. I have a super quick favor to ask. When you have a moment, please take just a second to give this podcast a 5-star review. This will help me to continue the podcast and continue to bring these resources to the community. Thank you so much for that 5-star review.
There were a lot of kids that were so upset about feeling like they looked stupid, getting it wrong, that kind of stuff. And nobody likes to do the things that are really hard for them to do that don't come naturally. So I became really passionate about how to get buy-in from the kids, how to support them, kind of that emotional sort of self-concept piece.
Hey there, it's Brooke, and welcome to Finding Hope on the Spectrum, where I have heart-to-heart conversations with parents, professionals, and autistic individuals sharing personal insight and life experiences. Together, we dive deep into supports, programs, and stories that offer inspiration, insight, and most importantly, hope for the neurodiverse community. Before we begin with today's topic, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. And if you know someone who this would be helpful for, please pass it along. Remember to always stay curious, be kind, and have an open heart.
All right. Well, welcome back to Finding Hope on the Spectrum. I'm really excited to have this conversation today. And, we're going to be talking about reading and dyslexia and, all of those things related today. And, reading is one of those really important skills, a child can learn, yet millions of children struggle to read despite being bright and so capable. And for families navigating dyslexia, finding answers and effective support can be super overwhelming. So I'm really excited that we have our guest today, Faye Bankler Casell. And did I pronounce your name right?
You did it great. Yeah.
Okay, good. Make sure they're certified academic language therapist, dyslexia specialist, and founder of Home Reading Coach. And Faye is super passionate about helping families understand dyslexia, access evidence-based reading instruction, and advocate for the support, for these children and what they need. So welcome, Faye. I'm so excited to have you on today.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, awesome. Well, let's just dive in and, kind of talk about, I love hearing my guest story of their journey. So let's have you share just a little bit about your journey into becoming a dyslexia specialist and kind of what first drew you to that work.
So I decided to go into teaching. I lived in New York City on September 11th, and I decided to shift gears and go into teaching. And I got my master's in early childhood education and special education. So I started out working with, the young ones, toddlers, preschoolers were sort of my sweet spot, and children with a variety of developmental delays, sometimes, labeled and identified, many times not, and supporting their development. So I did a lot of work with speech and literacy there. And when my own son was young, about a year old, I recognized that he was delayed. It's just sort of a career work, professional hazard. So before he was even 2 years old, he was doing speech therapy, I think 2 times a week, and occupational therapy multiple times a week. He had a lot of motor and language delays. And I told my husband, I don't know what this is, but he's probably going to have trouble when it comes time to reading. And I had already been thinking, because I was in Houston at the time, and there's a place called the Nye House Center that trains people specifically to be what's called a certified academic language therapist, a dyslexia therapist. And so I already had it in the back of my mind that maybe I was going to do that. And then a couple of things sort of came together. One was I got hired to work at the elementary school, so I was going to expand into the K through 5. And reflecting back on the things that I had learned in graduate school about reading instruction, they seemed very strange to me. I just felt like I don't know what that was that they taught me, but I need to go somewhere and really learn how to teach kids with disabilities how to read. all kids, but kids with disabilities. And then my son started school during that time, and he did struggle, and the lockdown happened. So I at that point, I hadn't really started my studies. I just kind of pulled on my history of working sort of, multisensory, multimodality, and kind of the basics that I knew. And I got him launched. I got him really kind of reading CBC words, high frequency words. He really jumped forward. And then he did go back to school, and he's been on track since then. But and he is not dyslexic. He has ADHD and he has dysgraphia. He is neurodivergent. But yeah, that really kind of brought me to that starting point. And then when I started working with children as a resource teacher, but also as a dyslexia specialist in the public schools, most of my kids have dyslexia and a lot of co-occurring things going on, whether it was ADHD or some sort of speech disorder, delay, autism. I just became really passionate about working with them, also specifically because I think that there's a really huge psychological toll that happens when a child struggles with reading and in a school setting. And I really recognized that there were a lot of kids that were so upset about feeling like they looked stupid, getting it wrong, that kind of stuff. And nobody likes to do the things that are really hard for them to do that don't come naturally. So I became really passionate about how to get buy-in from the kids, how to support them, kind of that emotional sort of self-concept piece, while also working very explicitly on reading skills, because I really do think you have to do both, right? You have to create this kind of safety for their brain to feel like it's okay to even try, because some kids really have shut down when I've started with them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so important. And, and the fact that you are looking at that piece as well, the emotional safety, we know that, that's such an important piece for learning to feel emotionally safe. And so, I think that's incredibly important. And yes, it's a social aspect too, because it's, clear in the classroom when your peers are around and, you're not able to perform at the same level.
One of the other things that I'm also, I also really care about for parents and teachers and anybody working with kids, or for kids themselves to understand, is that my goal for them is to comprehend what they're reading. So it doesn't matter that you can decode it if you can't have a conversation about it, right? And you're not going to be able to have a conversation about it and talk about what we're learning or what it means if you can't decode it. So for me, that, making sure that we're really thinking about the purpose for doing this work is to learn and to comprehend is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I definitely want to talk about kind of what, dyslexia actually is for those that, most people have heard of it, but not everybody really understands it fully. So I'd love for you to share kind of for people that may be new to them, what it is.
So dyslexia is a neurodivergence that really has to do with the phonological system in the brain. Now, I will say, and this is kind of going too far, but there are sort of different kinds of dyslexia, not unlike ADHD, autism, other sort of neurodivergence. You meet one person with dyslexia and that's one person, right? There's no cookie cutter, this is who they are. However, usually the sort of one of the root pieces is that there is a lot of struggle in the phonological component of the brain. So meaning hearing the sounds of letters, pulling apart words, pushing the sounds together, hearing the rhymes, attaching, that letter sound awareness. But there are other components too, like a lot of kiddos with dyslexia might struggle with like ordering the days of the week, right? The months of the year, those sorts of patterns. The flip side, not unlike other kids who are neurodivergent, is that it is a very capable, amazing, beautiful brain. And reading is hard. Part of the reason that reading is hard is because it's really sort of an unnatural thing, right? All humans are programmed to speak as a culture. Cultures have spoken oral language and hearing that language. But the moving into writing is something that is mostly all over the world, but your brain doesn't naturally do it. It has to move a lot of information around the brain in different systems. And when you are stronger in other areas, but weak in that phonological component, it can make reading really challenging. So the work there is really teaching reading in a very explicit, sequential, systematic way that kind of makes everything crystal clear on this is how we do it. And about 1 in 5 people have dyslexia. It's the most common reading disability, but there certainly are other things out there that can impact reading. And many kids with any kind of speech or language delay in early childhood, often that's an indicator that reading is going to be a struggle. It may not be dyslexia, but because reading ultimately emerges from spoken language first. So if there's any kind of kink in that chain, you can anticipate that you're going to have some more kinks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was curious if are there any myths, kind of related to misunderstanding dyslexia?
Sure. A long time ago, people thought that it was a visual issue. So now when I meet people and they say dyslexia, that's when kids flip letters, right? They see letters backwards. That's a pretty big misconception. Now, some kids do have an experience where they feel like the letters are swimming around the page. Sometimes they do have a visual something in addition to dyslexia that's going on. Sometimes it's just overwhelming to see that amount of text. And so they have that. It is a processing disorder. So again, no two people are the same. And the way that they process information coming in can look different for different kids. There are some people who think that it's not so helpful, and then there are others who do. But a lot of schools, online sort of dyslexia organizations, they'll host what they call kind of a virtual simulation. And I've participated in those before. And it's designed in such a way so that you don't fully access all of your processing systems at once, so that you can understand what it could feel like if one of your processing systems wasn't working the way that it does for the majority of the population, right? So, and how that environment or the way that material is presented to you can then put you at a disadvantage. So there's some value in doing that. I've had lots of people tell me like, yeah, that's nothing like what my dyslexia is. But, there's not going to be one experience for everybody.
Right. Oh, definitely. Yeah. Just to get a little idea, a little taste of it too is helpful, And I've experienced similar things, like those kinds of things that you're describing for autism specifically. So yes, I can definitely picture that. And I was curious, are there warning signs for families that, maybe that are listening or thinking, I'm not sure something's going on, but I'm not sure What do you typically see, or is there something you typically see in kids?
Well, a couple of things. One is usually you're going to see problems like in early childhood with rhyming, with memorizing, with remembering those nursery school rhymes, breaking out rhyme patterns, changing the sounds in words. Then the letter sound awareness, recognizing the letters of their own name. And I already sort of mentioned that kind of sequencing piece. A lot of times kids will say the wrong word that sounds like the word that they're trying to get, because that pulling, that's another component for a lot of people, is that rapid sort of recall of a word or a sound, pulling it forward. So you'll see a lot of kids who will fall back on good, bad, because they can't think of a different word, right? That's the only thing they can access in the moment. That kind of over reliance on very general sort of language is another one. And then any kind of labored, once you are reading, any kind of labored reading, often saying words that, again, look kind of close to the word, but maybe not quite right. So saying home instead of house when you're reading, or seeing in the picture that that it's a family and saying mother and father when the text says mom and dad. So those sort of picking up on indicators that there's a lot of guessing happening. Some kids who are very strong visual learners have the capacity to memorize words by the look of them when they're young. And so that can be challenging for families, because then they do think they're reading. One of the things that I was against for a while and am now completely sold on is utilizing these nonsense words that follow phonics patterns. So if it's a consonant vowel consonant word that is a non-word, then the child wouldn't have had an opportunity to memorize it because it doesn't exist in a text. So those sorts of things can be challenges at home, things to do to just make sure they're actually able to decode what's placed in front of them. And then for those kids who are successful at sort of masking or memorizing words by sight, that usually breaks down by third grade, because that's when the texts move into really unfamiliar territory with a lot of academic language. So people can pick up on things, early on. And then we have a lot of kids that they're going into middle school and somebody is starting to recognize, oh, they're guessing a lot. No, this is, we need to probe more. As far as assessment, any family, regardless of enrollment, homeschool, can get tested by their public school system and requested. A lot of people do private testing. On my YouTube channel, Teach My Child to Read, I interview some licensed psychologists who are former school psychologists, and they really walk us through. It's a 3-part video, kind of the differences between public school testing, private school testing, how to advocate for your child if you're going the public route, that sort of thing. That's some helpful things for parents to know. And the other thing that's helpful to know is that you don't need your child to be labeled dyslexic in order to intervene. If you see that something's not clicking for your child, there is no harm in teaching them the way that we teach dyslexic learners, because it is a systematic, sequential, and explicit kind of approach that is helpful for all, necessary for a good segment, and just absolutely essential for kids with dyslexia. So it's not going to harm your child to walk them through those steps.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I want to talk more about that and what that looks like as well. And it was interesting. I just ran into a family friend the other day, and she was like, I think my grandchild might be going down this path of, having some challenges. And who do we go to? Like, who are the professionals for diagnosing?
Yeah.
And so would you say there's a variety of people that diagnose for dyslexia or evaluate for dyslexia, or like who are the main people if somebody wanted to have their child evaluated?
Okay, that's really helpful. So a couple of things. One is on my website, which is homereadingcoach.com, and I can also give you a link for it, but I have something called the Free Dyslexia Roadmap for Families. And its purpose is just to give them a starting point for frequently asked questions and a lot of contacts, and sort of agencies, organizations, information sources, particularly for that reason, because it is really overwhelming. So certainly the public school, they will sometimes, and it aggravates me to no end, say that they don't test for dyslexia. But if you push on them and say the words, I think my child has a specific sort of learning disorder, SLD, that's kind of their code for dyslexia. And they'll look for, indicators of it. Those private, there are licensed psychologists. I have heard of some touts like me, certified academic language therapists, who do some testing. But I think it's usually because they've doubled down to become diagnosticians, because really we intervene, we don't diagnose. And I do know that some, not all, speech and language therapy is an enormous umbrella, but there are practices or people who focus really specifically on learning disabilities, and sometimes their assessments will capture components of dyslexia, but not the full umbrella. You're going to want more of a diagnostician, psychologist, school psychologist for that.
Okay. Yeah, that's super helpful. And even in the field of psychology, that's such a big umbrella. It's really finding somebody that knows dyslexia.
Right. There are a lot of great parent organizations. Every state pretty much has a parent advocacy branch of Decoding Dyslexia, which is a parent group. And that can be a wonderful place to start. Sometimes they have kind of parent mentors who will hold your hand and sort of walk you through that informational fact-finding piece. My roadmap has a lot of resources for families. There's a great website, which I'm sure your listeners know, the understood.org, that's very parent-friendly. And I also have, links to the International Dyslexia Association, that sort of thing, because there are also different kinds of professionals who work with kids with reading disabilities and different ways that they get certified and trained. And it's a lot of overwhelming information. And it feels wrong that every family, I feel like, has to reinvent the wheel when they have concerns for their kids. Like this should not be so hard to figure out. But those are some good places to get started.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'll have you send me all the links that would be helpful, and we'll include them in the show notes for families. So that would be great.
This show is brought to you by Therapeutic Approach to Growth. Therapeutic Approach to Growth helps families with relationship and behavioral needs. Their holistic programs are individualized to honor and respect each family and their autistic son or daughter's sense of self through programs such as relationship development intervention, naturalistic ABA, and animal-assisted services. If you're finding yourself frustrated or discouraged with your current behavioral programs and would like to see more long-term meaningful growth for you and your family, then contact TAG today at www.tagforgrowth.com. That's TAGFORGROWTH.com to learn more about how to schedule a consultation or how they can offer you the help your family needs, whether in person, remotely, or in a school setting. Again, that's www.tag4growth.com.
All right. Well, let's talk about kind of your approach. You mentioned a little bit, this approach, and kind of break it down for families that, are kind of learning right now or new to the program, new to the concept of dyslexia. What kind of approach do you take?
So I really emphasize multisensory learning. So as we mentioned, the processing of information, right, can come in through different channels. And when you're working with a kiddo with a processing issue, you really want to access sort of multiple information channels so that the learning can really stick. I think of multisensory teaching as like those sort of bullseye targets with the Velcro ping pong ball. And so the target has that sticky so that it can attach. So I kind of think of the ping pong as like the concept, and you're finding different ways to help it stick. So the multisensory piece is really helpful due to the processing and also just for attentional issues. And then there's the being systematic and explicit. So one of the key things is I mentioned before that I don't diagnose. I do assess kids. I start from the very beginning to make sure they can identify uppercase and lowercase letters out of orders, that they can give me their sounds, because sometimes they don't know. I can be working with an 8-year-old who's a little uncertain about some of the letters. Sometimes these things kind of get missed. And we start with the most foundational pieces. So starting with that spoken language and then tying that letter sound awareness together and moving through concepts in a really structured, logical way. So starting with the letter sounds, moving into those consonant, vowel, consonant, teaching different syllable types, teaching helping kids really hear the sounds in words and then attaching them to spelling, the way those sounds can get spelled. And vice, and going in both directions, seeing things spelled this way. And it really is, it just gets down to a very granular level, like the sound, right? At zoo. Zebra. If you were to ask any kid, what spells that sound, they would say is Z, which is not incorrect. That's completely correct. But really only in the first position of the word. Most words that have that sound, it's spelled with an S, like in nose, rose, that sort of thing. So it really is breaking down so explicitly for kids, when the letter's in this position, or when the sound is in this position, we spell it this way. And so it does take time. It's a lengthy process, depending on, the severity, of the impact. So I would say 1.5 to 3 years of really intensive intervention is definitely beneficial. And that's a lot for families to hear, but the lifetime impact is I think really worth it, right? So it's, you'll see it, and then you'll just see a lot of review, a lot of exposure. So your typical reader, if you think about words and reading becoming really automatic, that automatic recall, which is a struggle for most people with dyslexia. I mentioned the pulling the words forward, but just pulling any information forward can be a struggle. And when you're reading, you want to read with this fluency and this pacing so that you can really follow the line of thinking in the text, whether it's you're learning some information or you're following a narrative. And if you can't read fluently, then you kind of lose the story. So in order to read a word fluently, you really have to work on this automaticity. And so that your sort of typical reader might encounter a word once they're proficient, they might encounter a word only once, or maybe it'll take up to 4 times before they know how to read that word, how to spell that word. They've got it kind of in their working memory and their long-term memory. For a child with dyslexia, they might need up to 200, 300 exposures to the same word in order to get it really secure in their long-term memory. And so there's a lot of repetition and cycling back and then making one small step forward, but constant review cycle, just so that the information can really get in there and become automatic. That's a huge component.
That really brought it to life, just hearing, the difference in the need for that repetition. And, that is a significant difference. And, it does sound like, maybe 3 years sounds like a long time, but in the long run, it's actually a short time in the grand scheme of things for kids, just to really be able to be successful.
And that's not all kids. Some kids are faster. But yeah. And, it's one of those things where, so it's best not to do a wait and see, because the brain is so pliable when they're young. I mean, this working with kiddos with autism. It just, I hate to sound like a salesman, but you just get so much bang for the buck when you intervene at a younger age. And so the data shows that we can identify the signs of dyslexia with about a 92% accuracy at age 5.5. They don't even have to be reading formally, to have the signs there. And you can have such bigger, greater outcomes at a younger age. So in like first grade, if you start work with a kid intensively, there's what's considered kind of a 90 to 95% success rate, meaning that around third grade, the time that you're done, they're on grade level, they maintain grade level, they're proficient readers. Whereas if you wait until third grade to start, it takes 2 to 4 times as long, and the success rate cuts in half. So it's really beneficial for any parent, any teacher, if they just feel like, I just not so sure this is going great. You're never going to regret throwing a few more resources at your child at a younger age when their brain is so able to absorb that info.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And would you say that most public schools have some kind of specialist in there, the resource teacher or the psychologist that is knowledgeable in dyslexia? Is that common?
So I just want to make sure. Can you hear me okay? Because you got a little staticky on my end.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure. So all schools under federal law, all public schools under federal law are required to test if they or the parents suspect dyslexia, or what they'll sometimes call like a specific, learning disability. And so they should have access to diagnosticians who can test and then teachers who can teach. The reality is that of the 1 in 5 kids who have dyslexia in the population and the public schools, only 1 in 5 of those are getting identified in services. There are a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes the schools refuse to test, and they refuse to test because of a variety of outdated thinking that I'm happy to help any family push back against. Sometimes they'll use data points as proof that they don't need to test, like that the child is passing kindergarten or first grade. And to them, I ask, are 20% of the kids failing kindergarten and first grade? Because I doubt they are. And if failing kindergarten is your standard for testing, then you're wrong. Like that doesn't, the numbers don't match. Or sometimes they'll say, oh, well, they passed this beginning of year assessment. Is that assessment designed to pick up characteristics of dyslexia? No, it's not. So sometimes the schools refuse to test. Sometimes they test and they say, your child does have characters of dyslexia, but we are not providing services to them because the impact is not severe enough to require it. Like that question of educational need, which is a really frustrating sticking point. So a lot of parents get stuck in these cycles. Most parents that I know fight for 2-ish years with schools. Either they get it going or they start the fight. And so I've met people who've fought for up to 5 years. And part of the reason that I, started the program that I did is I am great with families getting their kids help for free at public school or any old place that they need it. But I just don't want them to wait, so you can use this as a stopgap while you're doing the fight, or sometimes you do have to go outside of the school system. There should be people who are trained to work with kids with dyslexia. That being said, I'm going to just step over here because my dog's scratching the door. It really varies from state to state what standard that is. And, you can't, I'm sure, guiding families through IEPs. You can dictate that services are needed. You can decide on goals and schedule and all sorts of things, but you don't get to tell the state, unfortunately, who is qualified to do that, if that person has met whatever that standard is. So there's a lot of variance in quality. There's a lot of parent organizations out there really advocating hard to get states on board with really pushing and, curricula that are aligned with the science of teaching reading, dyslexia interventions that have been validated. Different families have told me, oh, well, my school uses this. And I'll say, that's not validated for dyslexia. That's a great program for a lot of readers, and it can be used as what's called a tier 2 intervention, but it's not intensive enough for kids with dyslexia. So there's I wish it were better than it was, but there's a lot of unfortunate things happening in the teaching of reading across the United States. And it's just very uneven. It's kind of like playing a lottery.
Yeah. Well, and I know kind of that's what helped kind of motivate you or led you to creating your program that you're offering that provides access to families that are not necessarily in your area. So I'd love for you to share, a little bit more about kind of what you're doing and that in your program, your remote program. I know you also have in-person support as well.
Right. So I do teach kids, one-on-one in small groups, both privately and then public school. I'm moving up to middle school this year. I'm really excited. So, but this program, the Reading Breakthrough, is, again, it's designed to be just very affordable and help families implement kind of what I would implement. So it is a systematic, sequential program. And at this point, I've laid out the first 13 weeks of it. Parents have a choice. So I do a direct teach lesson video. It's asynchronous of whatever concept is being taught. So the parent can watch with the child, or if the parent wants to do the lesson themselves, great. They can watch me model it. They know exactly how to do it, and they can do it. So that has some flexibility to it. in the teaching of the concepts. And then there is all the other stuff around it. So the spelling, the comprehension, the word work, the reading practice, that kind of stuff. And I, via video, train the parents how to do that, how to correct, how to do this, and I walk them through it. I model it. And so that the child can have a comprehensive dyslexia intervention, something that goes a lot deeper than like just reading and spelling, right? Because again, the goal is comprehension and written expression. There are other things that families can add to it. They can add like live group coaching. They can go to a coaching community. They can, do one-on-ones with me, that sort of stuff. But the ultimate goal is that you're doing it alongside your child, and then you're facilitating the parts that I would be doing with them if I were in person. I've broken it down in such a way where you're really just implementing. It's not, you don't have to know, everything about dyslexia, but I can't be there to do it in person. And so what I do walk them through are those things about, okay, here's a word. What if your child reads it wrong? And just walk them through 3 ways that I would help the child correct themselves and why I would do that, that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's right now we've got sort of the founding family offer out. Right now it's $77 and it's about 53 concepts, lessons. I walk the families through just a very simple assessment at the beginning so that they can know where they're starting and then measure along the way. And then there are other add-ons like cursive, which is great for kids with dyslexia. It helps a lot with letter confusion and reversal. It helps with fluent writing. It's actually just so much easier to write once you get the hang of it, because as far as the lowercase letters go, they all start and end, pretty much on the same baseline. So there's a lot of value to that. And, for some families, it is not the right fit. And for some families, it's the perfect fit, or it's going to get them through that fighting period, or it's going to be a great summer, thing to do with their kids, or whatever the case may be. I'm just a really big believer in, all families and all kids are unique and they need a variety of options. So for the folks that this is the right option for, it exists. And yeah, I'm happy for any of your listeners to try it out. It would be great. I can give you a coupon code.
Okay, awesome. That would be great. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And it does sound very tangible for families, that, and especially those, that may be struggling to get the services for their child, whether it's the area they're in or just the battle with the school, whatever it may be. It's so nice to have another resource and something available that they can learn to do. And as you were describing it, I was curious. A lot of times when I talk to new families about the therapies that we do, they want to know, like, what is the commitment like? How often do you do it? What's the timeline when you're sitting down with your child? What does that look like? What do you typically recommend for these kids?
So when I originally put it together, I was sort of writing it with the expectation that it was sort of 4 times a week. That being said, as time went on and talking to families and thinking about, my own work with my son, the reality is family life is so different, to sit down uninterrupted for X amount of time. The concept lesson and that kind of portion needs to all go together, and that's a hunk of time. But the other things, like some of it can happen at breakfast. It can happen, the phonological piece can happen in the car. It can happen. So I do think that families have that flexibility. But again, like we talked about earlier, that repetition and the repeated exposure really is key. And that is hard. That is a commitment. So I would say that if you can get in kind of 4 mini lesson times during the week And all the other things, like you could trade off days and do the comprehension work, the alphabet work, whatever. You can kind of make those happen as like, we do this reading at bedtime, that sort of stuff. Then it works just fine. It's really about getting that intensity in and the frequency so that their brains can rewire, because that is what happens when you do my level of therapy. When they scan the brain, they can actually see the new neural pathways going in because it is so intensive. So
yeah. Well, and I think that's great. I mean, that's the important thing, is that you want to have that high level of success. And so, that's the ultimate goal. And it's great that they can fit it into daily life as well. When they're driving or at breakfast, or, that they learn that. I think when parents learn how to apply things as more of a lifestyle, in addition to the structured activities, that's kind of what we do in our program as well. We follow that model. It makes such a big impact because there's just so many more opportunities.
Yes. And it's helpful. I mean, I know you primarily work with kids on the autism spectrum, but it's helpful for all kids to get this opportunity to learn and implement skills across environments, and sort of at different periods in different ways, so that they can expand them and generalize them and utilize them in the context where you need them. So rather than it just be, this is the time I sit down and we do this lesson and then I don't think about it again ever,
Exactly. Yes. For our brains to, to internalize and be dynamic, it is so true. It's so important. And it really does help to bring it to life. And, I'd love to have you share, if you have like a sample lesson or a sample activity, just to kind of illustrate what that might look like for a family if they're considering this.
Okay. You're putting me on the fly, but I'm going to do my best. So a lot of, first of all the printable materials are included, and I even have like a lesson where we prep them so I can walk you through what you're doing. We utilize a lot of visual supports, and then again, the multisensory component is really huge. So, for example, I'm just going to go like super, super, super foundational. Yeah. When you talk about the alphabet, letters of the alphabet, we skywrite them, which is building up that strength that, people think of writing as happening in your palm and your fingers. It actually starts really in your shoulder. And then different kinds of games like that, we'll both reach into the bag and pull out a letter. And by the feel of the letter, try to identify what letter we have, right? Because you think of that tactile kind of moving the shape around in your hand and really understanding the structure of that letter, it's easier to write it later, right? Or read it. It imprints on the brain more. Sandpaper letters, lots of sort of sensory, work with that. I play yes, no games with kids on like the secret letter. So is your letter before M or after N? Is your letter a vowel? Does your letter, does it have only lines or does it have curves? That kind of thing. So a lot of different ways to get the information in. When I teach a concept, so here, let's see. I was just traveling, so I don't have everything where it usually is. But like, I don't know, when I'm teaching a concept on how you identify something or whatever, like there's a visual piece. I utilize a lot of hand signals. So and the kids ultimately learn to do it with me so that there is a visual, oral, kinesthetic component. So like we talk about consonants. Consonants close the mouth and the sound is blocked or partially blocked by the tongue, teeth, or lips. And you'll see kids ultimately get to this point where I'm like, well, how do you know it's a consonant? And they're like, because consonants close. You can see their hands moving. And that's so really, again, finding ways for the information to attach, for them to take it in visually, orally, that sort of thing, is a great example. when we are doing spelling, so I walk them through like very explicit, how is this sound spelled in this, way. So first we're saying the words, we're listening for the sound that's the same. And then I might, what letter is spelling it and showing them where, and talking about how it's spelled, giving them the very explicit, when you hear the sound, in final position, it's usually spelled SE kind of thing. And then doing the spelling, I have, for example, like those nice little decorative glass beads that you might put in jars and things to make all beautiful. They make a very satisfying clicking sound, and they slide on the table, and they're colorful. And so for a lot of kids, that breaking up of sounds is hard. So when we're spelling a word, and I want them to break up the sounds, the touching the bead and moving it with each sound, and then going back and touching the bead and saying the letter or letters that are spelling that sound. So I feel like I'm talking to you more than I'm demoing for you. But
Well, no, that brings it to life for sure. And when you said, the multisensory modalities, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially for this population that, my population with the autism spectrum, they often need that, to really bring it to life.
I mean, it's just, I guess for me, I would say that any opportunity to take the information out of just the oral sphere, so that the kids can process faster and better. I don't know that you can see these, but when we read a book, one of the first comprehension activities that we really work on is just answering your basic, who, what, when, where, retelling. And so this card has the word who, but it also has, a pictorial symbol for who. They're the blue cards. So you kind of know, like, this is the point where we're going to talk about the story. The touching and moving it, giving them kind of like that prompt of a complete sentence of the story is about, as they're moving the who card, the story is set, that sort of thing. Then to move it into like a less automatic, more sort of fluid conversation, but really giving kids a framework for everything I'm asking them to do, so that they're not hanging, on the line struggling, but that you can build it so that they can experience success and then kind of scale back.
Yeah. Oh, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. And I think I've seen that work so well, just having that framework. I think when they understand their role, then they can be successful with the challenge. And so, and then they don't need all that scaffolding eventually. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And the visuals too are so key. So thank you for sharing all of that. That was super helpful, just to hear kind of those strategies and those supports. And there's just concrete, there are things that families can do, in their home. And so it's fantastic that you're making it available for families that don't have that support, or may not, may want to do it themselves. A lot of families that I work with, they want to learn themselves.
They do. And I think that it's so empowering for parents and the kids to do these things at home, even if you're not, taking the primary teaching role. You want to read, you want to hear your child read to you, let's say from decodable text, that kind of thing, to make sure that they really are reading it, they understand it, but I so many parents that I work with are early on, there's so much anxiety and fear, and that's completely natural and makes 100% sense. I think it's empowering, for the parent and they're better advocates for their family when they feel like they have some sort of handle on what it looks like for their child, or some of the things that work for their child. It's a really empowering position.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah. And that's just such a fantastic component to what you're providing them, and I think it's important for families to have the right to have the knowledge, if that's something that's important to them, right? Because it's just not always the case, and not everybody empowers parents in that way, and that's okay. But I think if families want to know, they have these resources.
Yes, I agree.
So, and if there was kind of one message that you wanted every parent of a struggling reader to hear today, what would that be?
So a couple of messages. I feel like one is that, again, the purpose of reading really is comprehension. So you want to make sure your child isn't just saying words on a page, but really comprehending. Another is that trust your gut. I can't tell you how many parents felt like there was something going on and the school said no, and they, followed the school's lead, and I would too. I get it. But be the squeaky wheel, because again, there's no harm in assessing your child for dyslexia. It's a test.
Yes.
I mean, I would say, do not accept no on the assessing it. Honestly, if that was one thing I could tell families, do not accept no. I know way too many schools and parents, I've heard too many stories of them being denied testing. And I feel like I should just write up a whole thing on things to say when a school refuses to test.
Yeah.
Because there's no harm. And one of the things that you can't say is, I get that you think that he doesn't need to be, tested or served or whatever. The way to validate that is to do the assessment. I mean, there's just no other better alternative. So those are key things. And let's see, I felt like there was one other thing. But yeah, the don't wait to test, and I would say, oh yes, the last thing I wanted to say is, if they do assess your child and you're now having that IEP conversation about services. The school is going to, right? And I do this too. I'm going to walk into the room and say, here's what I think would be a great starting point, for our conversation, what I might recommend. And then it's a conversation. I want parents, when they go into that initial IEP, to imagine that every other person around that table is a cater waiter or a cocktail waitress, and that what they are telling you they will do, should do, must do is really just kind of, they're offering you hors d'oeuvres. Do not take it like it's this way or not, right? Just like, here you go. Would you like, 3 times 30 minutes a week? To really think of it that way, because you are the most important person in the room. You are the only one who's going to be with that child for the life of their education, and your contribution is equal. It's equal and valid. So I just really, I even did a video for parents on how to fake being confident in ways that you would trick me if you walked in. Not that I'm going to take advantage of you, but things that if I saw you doing, I would feel like you know your stuff. And, it's just really important, because unfortunately, there are some schools and some folks who just are kind of skimming the surface. And so you need to, you can trust, but also verify. So.
Yes. I love that. Yeah. And I think that's important. And again, it goes back to the parent being empowered and educated, so they have the tools to come prepared for these meetings and to advocate for their child. It's just, what they have to do. And so you mentioned a lot of resources. Where is the best place for people to find you? And again, we'll include all that in the show notes.
So my website is homereadingcoach.com. My Facebook and Instagram socials are Home Reading Coach. And that's where I share, those short little kind of everyday things. I do deeper dives on my YouTube channel, which is Teach My Child to Read. you can access, I will also give you the link, but you can access the free dyslexia roadmap for families. It's about a 90-page kind of mini ebook. There's a link on my website. And then there's also a link for the Reading Breakthrough program through there and all my socials and everything. So those are good ways to reach me. And like I said, I can provide a coupon code, and on the sort of landing page for the Reading Breakthrough program, I do have kind of little videos so you can sort of peek inside and see what all is in there. Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, this was so wonderful, Faye. I loved having you on and learning more about, I definitely learned more about dyslexia myself. And, I just appreciate your passion for this population and the supports you're offering. I think it's such an important thing you're doing for the community. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. And I hope to hear from any listeners who could use some help.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Take care.
I'm dancing on the edge again. The wind is calling my name. I'm dancing on the edge again. This time I'm not looking back there. You can change me, you can tell me down. I'll leave echoes in every place I find. I'll break the molds with rebels mind. I'm a hurricane of free born mind.
The information provided on this podcast is for general informational purposes only. The content shared is based on the experiences, opinions, and perspectives of the hosts and their guests and should not be construed as medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment recommendations. The discussions and topics covered are intended to foster understanding and awareness of autism therapies, but are not a substitute for professional medical guidance. Before making any decisions regarding therapies or treatments, we strongly encourage you to consult with a qualified healthcare provider who can provide personalized recommendations based on your unique circumstances. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge and agree that the hosts, guests, and producers are not responsible for any consequences, damages, or outcomes arising from the use or application of any information during the show.